Hi, and thanks for joining me today as we talk about trauma-informed care and vicarious and secondary trauma. So trauma is more than just an event. Trauma is an experience. A traumatic event is an experience of physical sensations and psychological disruptions. The brain assigns meaning to the experience and labels the memory accordingly. This process is unique to every person, which is why an event may be traumatic to one person, but not to another. Trauma has an effect. Experiencing a traumatic event has an adverse effect on the mind and the body. These biological reactions may occur immediately or may be delayed, and the duration may be short term or long term. The individual may not recognize the connection between the traumatic event and the effects. How common is trauma? So, at least 70% of adults in the United States have experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their lives. That equals over almost 224 million people. There are many types of different traumas. There's natural traumas, which are caused by natural disasters, such as rainstorms or hurricanes. There's human caused trauma that could be caused by human failure, such as accidents, or by human design, such as a robbery or a war. There's political terror and war events. So this is a subtype of human caused trauma with the goal of maximizing anxiety and fear. It results in reminders or unpredictability of terroristic acts, intensified suspicion, and heightened awareness. There's also individual trauma, and that happens to just one person, such as a physical injury, a rape, an illness, a sexual assault. There's group trauma, and that's experienced by small groups, such as first responders, military personnel, or gang violence. Then we're looking at community trauma, and that's trauma that affects the community as a whole. So that could be within the schools, the neighborhood, the town, or our cultural groups. There's mass trauma, and that's when trauma affects large groups, such as large scale national, natural, and human caused disasters. There's interpersonal traumas, and that's when trauma occurs between people, such as physical and sexual abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, and elder abuse. This usually happens when there's intimate partners involved or other close relationships. Then there's developmental traumas, and that's trauma that happens in the developmental stage and influences later development, such as adverse child experiences or ACEs, death of a parent or significant other, or being diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. And then system-oriented traumas, and that's when the survivor experiences something that makes them feel a certain type of way within a system that can be re-traumatizing without even being conscious of it. So what are some common triggers that one might experience after a traumatic event? So it might be reminders of past events, lack of power and control, current or past conflict in relationships, a great feeling of separation or loss. There might be transitions and schedule disruptions, such as a new client coming into shelter, new client moving out, or new staff changes. A victim might be feeling vulnerable or feeling rejection, such as like the staff doesn't listen to me. They might be feeling threatened or attacked, extreme loneliness. There might be sensory overload, which could mean like different smells, sounds, movements, objects. There might be significant life events, even exciting or happy ones, such as a new marriage, a new birth in the family, or something such as a divorce or a funeral. And any event or situation that resembles or symbolizes the trauma might make them remember. So trauma has different responses. So there's emotional, cognitive, and physical reactions to trauma. So an emotional reaction might be fear, grief, anger. The victim might be feeling guilty or depressed or sad, feeling despair or hopelessness, resentment, helplessness, emotional numbness, feeling overwhelmed. They might face some cognitive reactions such as trouble concentrating or remembering things, confusion, difficulty making decisions, preoccupation with the event, reoccurring dreams or nightmares, questioning their own spiritual beliefs. They might have a crazy attention span, like either really short, memory problems, or self-blame. And then they might experience physical reactions. These could be tension fatigue, restlessness, sleep disturbances, feeling achy and pains in your body all the time, having an increase or decrease in appetite, hypertension or heart pounding, the racing heartbeat, nausea, a quick startle response or headaches. And then they might feel more distrustful, irritable, may have sleep problems, might start crying easily, increased conflicts with the family or friends, withdrawal from others, feeling rejected and abandoned, or being judgmental or over controlling. And this is especially true as children. There's a lot of different impacts of trauma. So that child might feel a loss of safety. The world becomes a place where anything can happen to them. They might have a loss of danger cues. So how do you know what's dangerous when someone you trust hurts you? And then is this your new normal? That child might feel a loss of trust. This is especially true if the abusive person is a family member or a close friend, a neighbor, someone that you trust. The child might feel a lot of shame. They might feel a huge, overwhelming, debilitating shame. As a child, even getting an exercise wrong at school can trigger the shame. The child may grow into an adult who cannot bear to be wrong because it's such a trigger for them. They might feel a loss of intimacy, especially for survivors of sexual abuse. Sexual relationships can either become something to avoid, or that child or young adult might enter into the relationship for approval. Since the child learns that sex is a good way to get attention, they might use that, and that child might be labeled as promiscuous. There might also be disassociation. So often to cope with what's happening to the body during the abuse, the child would disassociate and disconnect the consciousness from what's happening. And later this becomes a coping strategy for that child. They might also feel a loss of physical connection to the body. So survivors of sexual and physical abuse often have a hard time being in their own body. This disconnection from the body makes some therapies know to aid trauma recovery, such as yoga, might be harder for these survivors. Or I've heard of survivors that intentionally will gain weight to feel less attractive, cut their hair a certain way so that they're less noticeable. They just want to blend in. They also might feel a loss of sense of their self. So one of the roles of the primary caregiver is to help us discover our identity by reflecting who we are back at us. If the abuser was a parent or caregiver, then the sense of the self is not well developed and can leave us feeling phony or fake. We might also feel a sense of loss of self-worth. So trauma survivors can swing between feeling special with grandiose beliefs about themselves and feeling dirty and bad. This aggrandizement is an elaborate defense against the unbearable feeling of being an outcast and unworthy of love. And then there might be reenactment. So recreating the childhood dynamic, expecting the same result, but hoping it's a different one. This strategy is usually doomed to fail because the need is in the past and cannot be resolved. Also, you'll interpret anything as confirmation that you have been betrayed once more. So people who have experienced trauma are 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 4 times more likely to develop an STI, 4 times more likely to inject drugs in their lifetime, 3 times more likely to use antidepressant medication, 3 times more likely to be absent from work, 3 times more likely to experience depression or to have serious job problems, 2.5 times more likely to smoke tobacco products, and 15 times more likely to commit suicide. So what is trauma-informed care and why is it so important? So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, defines a trauma-informed approach as a program, organization, or system that realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, and staff, and others involved with the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. So a trauma-informed lens is really about shifting our questions from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, how might we help you, and eventually with the right support, how might we use your story as fuel to make the world a better place for yourself and for others. So what does trauma-informed care look like within our agency? That could look like explaining the what and why of what we're doing, offering choices rather than making decisions for victims, asking what we can do to make the process easier for them, Allow victims to be accompanied by an advocate, a trusted friend, a family member. If they want to come in and do intake with someone or to come in and talk about their story, allow them to have that trusted person with them. Allow victims to share only what they're comfortable with and provide a safe, calm, and welcoming environment for that client. How can shelters be re-traumatizing? This could look different in many different shelters. So if a shelter doesn't have locks on the door or the locks don't work, that could lead to a lack of privacy. They might not have private spaces for confidential conversations. Being around other families who have different styles of cleanliness, parenting styles, different definitions of quiet. Staff or other shelter residents who mirror abusive behaviors by implementing rigid or excessive rules or replicating power and control. And another example is if in like the shelter's office, there's a bulletin board with a list of clients' names and their dates, arrival in public view, and their names are listed below the advocate's name in which they're assigned. This could really demonstrate or show that level of power over that client. So we just want to make sure that we're being careful what's in view of our clients, how we're talking with them, what do our rules look like? Are they replicating power and control over that victim? Staff and agency issues can also result in re-traumatizing clients. So that could look like disrespectfully challenging reports of abuse or other traumatic events, discounting a client's report of a traumatic event, allowing the abusive behavior of one client towards another to continue without intervention, minimizing, discrediting, or ignoring client responses, disrupting advocates. So that could be by changing advocate schedules or assignments, or like if we go on vacation for 2 weeks and we don't tell that client and we just expect another advocate to pick up where we left off, that could be really re-traumatizing for that client without having that open communication. It could also look like being insensitive to a client's physical or emotional boundaries, or accepting agency dysfunction, including a lack of consistent, competent leadership. So there are 6 principles of trauma-informed approaches. One is safety. So the physical and psychological safety is a priority within our organization for staff and the people who are served. Trustworthy and transparency in all of our operations and decisions. Our organizational business is conducted with transparency. That means, especially if we're working with a client and we're taking notes or something, allowing that client, like I always tell clients, hey, is it okay if I take notes? Is it okay if I jot this down? If I have to check my cell phone for something, being honest about that, like, hey, I just need to check this really quick. I'm so sorry. Just always being transparent when we're working with clients about what we're doing and why we're doing that. Then we want to look at peer support. So people's stories and lived experiences are valued and recognized as a key to building safety, establishing trust, and growth after healing. Mutual self-help and peer support are valued as vehicles for recovery and growth. Number 4 is collaboration and mutuality. So everyone has a role to play in a trauma-informed approach. Power differences between staff and people served and within staff are leveled in a favor of a shared decision-making. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So individual strengths and experiences should be recognized and built upon throughout the organization. Our culture should foster a belief in the of the people that we're serving, in resilience, and in the ability of the individuals, organizations, and communities to heal and promote recovery from trauma. And lastly, cultural, historical, and gender issues. So our organizations that actively move past cultural biases, offer access to gender responsive services, leverage the healing value of traditional cultural connections, incorporate policies, protocols, and processes that are responsive to the racial, ethnic, and cultural needs of individuals served, and recognize and address the historical traumas. So we want to make sure that we're encouraging victims to take control. We can start by asking simple questions. What would you like to be called? What are your pronouns? Do you have a preference on where you sit? Is there anything I can get for you? When someone first walks in the door, we should be asking, is there anything we can get for you? Would you like some water, some coffee, a snack perhaps? Are you cold? Would you prefer the door open or closed? And then continue by determining other ways that we can help the victim regain control. So we want to help identify and address the victim's safety needs, Make suggestions that can increase safety. For example, if a victim feels safe being alone, and is there anything that we can do to increase their sense of safety? We want to give victims as much control as possible, such as letting them decide when and where they want to talk and in what order to do things. We want to give them information to help them make informed decisions. We always want to explain the processes such as examinations, interviews, investigations, our intake process, and who or what will be involved before beginning those processes. We want to maintain a non-judgmental attitude to help victims regain their power and control. Individuals who perceive judgment may immediately relinquish control to others and just to avoid those further judgments. We always want to make sure that we're treating victims as individuals rather than cases, and then helping them identify their strengths, because that can sometimes be really difficult for victims to do on their own. So we really need to make an effort to identify them for them. So the shoulds and should nots of trauma-informed care. So best practice, we want to invite conversation, but also allow for silence. It's okay to sit in quietness and allow the victim to sit with that and to speak when they're ready. We want to allow for expression of emotions. That could look different for every survivor. They might be angry. They might want to yell, scream, swear, cry, laugh, and all those things are okay as long as they're not being abusive towards you or other people. We want to make sure that we can stay with the survivor in their pain, not to allow them to tell their story and then walk away and not help them through it. It's okay to say, I don't know, when asked, why did this happen to me? Because we have no way of knowing that. And to ask what has brought comfort in the past and if this can be accessed now. Repeat their words and clarify to make sure you understand. We could say, let me make sure I'm understanding you. Paraphrasing, repeating back what they said to us. And offer options to feel better and healing that we can make available to them. But then we want to make sure that we're avoiding demanding eye contact. That can be really disrespectful for some folks. It can be uncomfortable, and in some cultures, it can be really offensive. We want to make sure that we're not getting too close to the victim. We don't want to ask too many questions. We don't need to know everything in order to help them. We never, ever want to make promises that we cannot keep. An example of that is telling somebody that we can keep them safe no matter what, or their abuser won't find them, or yes, we can for sure take you this place or give you this when we don't know for sure that that's going to happen. We don't want to say you should be over this by now, or you have to forgive them so you can start to heal. Never touch somebody without getting permission from them. I never hug somebody, give them a handshake, high fives, whatever, without asking first. We want to try to keep the focus on the survivor. Sometimes it's okay to share and disclose a little bit about your trauma if it relates to the survivor and you feel that it's going to help them have a better connection with you, but we never want to keep the focus on ourselves. It always should be on the survivor. And then we never want to ask the survivor to tell us about the traumatic incidents if they don't offer it. They are not there to satisfy our own curiosities. So how can we help survivors cope? We want to keep these goals in mind when discussing positive coping with trauma survivors. So coping skills should support the survivor making new safe connections with others. Experiencing traumatic events undermines a victim's sense of safe relationships with others, and some coping should focus on helping them reestablish trust and connection with others and the wider community. We can allow them to tell the story of the traumatic experience because that's essential to healing. Our society encourages and reinforces silence around women's and men's experiences of trauma, and we need to break this silence because that can be a big step in the healing process. And it's normal to be affected by trauma. Having traumatic reactions is not an indication of an individual's weakness. Reactions are a body and mind's attempts at processing and healing and should be honored as such. It's important for us to view survivors as having made it through an amazingly difficult experience and look to their strengths in surviving that experience and helping them recognize the way in which they have protected themselves and their children. We need to celebrate both who they are and acknowledge and honor what they have been through and support them in wherever they want to go. We also want to focus on some cultural considerations. So we want to focus first on the person and their needs, and then in the context of their family and culture. We want to work with survivors within their cultural traditions, their belief systems, or physical and mental disabilities. For an example, the victims and significant others, the community, family, clan, tribe, and tribe responses. We also want to identify barriers to accessing support and resource systems, such as individual, traditional, and societal, access and barriers to obtaining services, attitude towards seeking services, language barriers, including discussing their traumas, looking at our physical space. Do we have stairs versus access to ramps, and the sensitivity level in our community? This does not mean that an advocate needs complete knowledge of all the different cultures in the community, because that's just not possible, but rather the advocate has the skills and the willingness to work sensitively with victims from a variety of different cultures, and that we listen to what they need and want. We want to show support, provide that emotional support. You can reassure the survivor that they're safe now, provide empathy and support. We can validate the survivor's responses, encourage the survivor to talk about what happened, discourage the feelings of guilt and self-blame, and listen. So the next part, we're going to talk a little bit about the intake process, which of course, when folks are coming to shelter, is an important part of what we do. So the first thing we want to do is be welcoming. For an example, we might be able to say, I was wondering if you and I have time to sit down and talk so that I can get to know you a little better, and that we have an opportunity to ask some questions and you can tell me how you're doing with everything that you're going through. Or you could say, would you be open to choosing a time when we can sit down and talk about how you're feeling and some of your thoughts about your plans? When would you like to do this, now or a bit later? And some of these things I know are time sensitive. We have to get things signed and whatever. So we can do sometimes that bare minimum and make sure that the survivor is, doing okay and that they're feeling safe and comfortable before we continue on with the rest. So we want to make sure that we're having attentive listening skills, including being mindful of our body language. So are we leaning forward, nodding, and maintaining eye contact while conveying interest to that person? Are we aware of our physical boundaries around space and closeness? Can be related to both cultural norms and individual comfort levels. Folks might not want you in their bubble, so just make sure you're looking for their reactions. We want to give the individual time to settle into the shelter. If we need to gather critical information, we can explain this to them while understanding they might feel like there are more pressing issues at the moment. And if the client and family arrived in the middle of the night, we might only be able to take the names, ages, and medical information of the client and the children at this point, and then take a few minutes to gather the necessary information and talk with them more in the morning, and that's okay. So even though the intake is required paperwork, and also can be time to engage the individual while they share their experience. This connection will build a trusting relationship and hopefully lead them to more positive experiences in the future. We want to make sure that we're fully explaining the release of information and any other documents we're asking them to sign. Don't just give them the packet and just say, oh, can you sign these for me? Inform the individual what you're writing down and why you're documenting what they're sharing with us. And then state the intent of the intake process by describing what's going to occur. For example, you can say, we're going to spend some time together so that you and I can have some time, space to share what has been going on. You can stop and ask for breaks if you wish, and you can decide what you share and when you would like to share it. This informs the individual that they have power in this process, despite the fact that you have to do the intake. And then when we end the intake process, we want to ask the individual how they're feeling in the present moment and make sure that you're not letting the person leave feeling vulnerable. So how are you feeling physically and emotionally? How are you feeling inside? Do you have any questions that you want to ask me? Offer future assistance if they need to talk more. And then always end by talking about their strengths, their likes, and their hopes. We never want to leave them feeling hopeless at the end of that conversation. So we want to make sure that we understand trauma and violence and its impacts. We want to acknowledge the root cause of trauma without probing. Your clients don't necessarily need to disclose what has happened to them for you to help them. So we can say, I know that people have had difficulty experiences, often have difficulty trusting people in authority or have chronic pain. Pause and reflect when someone acts or reacts in an unexpected way. What happened to this person versus what's wrong with this person? You want to listen, believe, and validate their experiences. Like you could say, that sounds like a horrible experience, or no one deserves to be treated like that. Recognize the victim's strengths. You have really survived a lot. You're so brave. You're so courageous. You did so good by coming and talking with us. And then make sure you express your concern in an honest and vulnerable way. We also want to make sure that we're using collaboration and reducing our power dynamics. So all advocates have their own specialty, but we're all cross-trained. So we all should be able to address basic needs of our clients, whether that be um, a shelter intake, a hotline call, if they need clothing, or if they're looking for information on how to report a sexual assault or how to do a restraining order. We should all know how to do those things and help the person to the best of our abilities. We want to work together whenever possible and not in a silo. And then we want to make sure that we're reducing power dynamics. So think about our choices in clothing. Is it appropriate for the job? Does it show a power differential? If we're supposed to be playing with kids out in the yard, are we wearing heels and a short skirt? Like, we want to make sure that we're relatable with our clients. Sitting versus standing when talking to our clients. Are they sitting in a chair and we're standing over them? Are we sitting close together? Just looking at where we're positioned in our offices. And then offering choices instead of making decisions whenever possible. We always want to offer the options and empower them to make the choices that are best for them. The next part, we're going to talk a little bit about taking hotline calls. There's no way to say exactly how a hotline call will go. So these are just some tips when you are taking a call to be the most trauma informed that you can be. So just the way that we ask questions can be traumatizing. So we want to think through the impact of the questions we ask. So we don't want to ask the question why, because that makes a caller feel defensive by implying that they have some guilt involved. Rather, ask questions in a sensitive manner, such as, help me understand about this, or would you describe to me what this looks like? This approach conveys a non-judgmental attitude and provides the opportunity for the caller to share openly if they wish to do so. If possible, we want to find out the caller's first name, so that way we can call them by their name throughout the conversation. Repeating a person's name can help to engage them in a trusting relationship, as well as to show that you're attentive and that you listen to details. If they don't want to disclose their name, that's okay. You don't need to push it. But if they're offering it, make sure that you're utilizing that. For example, you can say, tell me, Susan, a little bit about what's going on today. Also ask for a callback number right away. Just in case you get disconnected, you have a way to call them back and ask, hey, is it okay if we get disconnected, if I call you back? If I get your voicemail, can I leave a voicemail for you? And then utilize open-ended questions because it provides an opportunity for the caller to feel invited to share their experiences, needs, and concerns. We want to establish physical safety with the caller. This shows the caller that you understand the possible risks to their safety. Inquire, before we talk about what's been happening, can I first ask if you're safe being on the phone? Are you alone or is someone near you? Trust that survivors are aware of their safety and know its importance. And then be transparent if you have to end the call. You may have to end the call abruptly, whether it's because you're getting another call, another client's at the door, or the doorbell's ringing. Ask if there's a safe number that you can call the victim back at, or is there a better way to contact, such as email or text messaging, and let them know that if they choose to call back, they can speak with any advocate about what's going on. Remember, trauma impacts how memories are stored and recalled. Stories survivors share with you might not follow a clear step-by-step recollection of events. And validate that sharing this information is difficult and it's normal to feel scattered or anxious when talking with a stranger about what's happening. And then trauma impacts how people experience feelings and emotions. There's no single way a survivor should feel about their experience. Some may be sad, some might be angry, and some might not express any emotion at all. Expect to hear a wide range of emotions when answering calls or with working survivors one-on-one. And be aware that emotions or feelings a survivor expresses might not be what you expect, especially about something serious or dangerous in the home. For example, the caller's tone of voice or words may not convey the intensity of what they're sharing with you. Domestic violence and sexual assault survivors have often been traumatized by someone who has had power over them. Be aware that you have the power over a caller and that reality impacts your relationship with the caller. Your power comes from your ability to accept or decline an individual's request for shelter or other services. You have information on important referrals that you can share or not share, and they know that. So we want to make sure that we're being open and honest with that person and just being cognizant of that power that we might hold over them. And we want to make sure that we're fostering resilience. So resilience is the capacity to bounce back, to withstand hardship, and repair oneself. There's no one way for a person to build resilience because there's an array of behaviors, thoughts, and actions associated with recovery. Victims can bolster their resilience by setting aside adequate time for sleep, staying connected with people who care, and taking time to do things they enjoy, such as reading, watching a movie, talking with a friend, listening to music, or going for a walk. So we want to make sure that we encourage victims to establish and reestablish routines, avoid major life decisions, such as switching careers or jobs in the acute crisis stage, develop realistic goals and do something regularly to advance the goals, find ways to measure and acknowledge personal growth, talk with others who have similar experiences through forums such as support groups. Some different types of coping skills that you can go over with victims. So one would be self-soothing. So comforting yourself through your five senses. So saying out loud something you can touch, such as stuffed animals or a stress ball. Something to hear, like music, meditation, guides. Something to see, such as a snow globe, happy pictures, artwork hanging on the walls. Something to taste, like mints, tea, or sour candy. And something to smell, like lotions, candles, or perfumes. You can offer distraction, taking your mind off the problem for a while, such as puzzles, books, artwork, things like that. Opposite action, doing something the opposite of your impulse that's consistent with a more positive emotion. So that could be affirmations and inspiration, like looking at a drawing or motivational statements or images, or something funny or cheering, like funny movies or TV and books. We want to really showcase emotional awareness, tools for identifying and expressing your feelings. So this could be a chart of emotions, journaling, writing supplies, art therapy, things like that. And also by practicing mindfulness. So tools for centering and grounding yourself in that present moment. So examples of that could be meditation or relaxation recordings, grounding objects like a rock or paperweight, a yoga mat, breathing exercises. And then we want to make sure that we have a crisis and safety plan. So contact information, supports, and resources for when coping skills just aren't enough. So that could be family, friends, therapists, psychiatrists, the hotline number, the crisis team, the emergency room, the advocates that are available. So pathways to resilience. Resiliency is the ability to bounce back from setbacks in our lives. It's the way we can prevent stress from causing serious physical, mental, and emotional issues. Practicing positive and often simple activities can actually retrain our brain to be more resilient. So for children, that could look like having positive role models, supportive adults in their life, parental involvement, and a caring community, increased parent-infant contact, and increased knowledge of child development. For adults, it could be acknowledging the trauma, seeking support, identifying emotional triggers, mental health and substance abuse treatment, and creating safe and stable, nurturing relationships. And for just everyone in general, having supportive relationships, walking in the woods, healthy foods and exercise, gratitude and positive thoughts. Just something as simple as smiling and laughing, talking about our feelings, hope, volunteering, and music. So resilience can lead to goal setting with realistic expectations, increased self-esteem, learning from our mistakes, understanding and accepting our own strengths and weaknesses. It can lead to self-control, a willingness to overcome difficulties rather than avoiding our problems. Social skills, the ability to seek assistance from others, the ability to recognize our own emotions and the emotions of others around us, and to have problem-solving skills. So a trauma-informed approach focuses on an understanding of the person's history and the entire context of their experiences. Each individual seeking services from the Bridge to Hope has their own unique history, background, and experience of victimization. We want to make sure that we're treating each survivor as an individual. That's why everything is so great in our field of work. There's nothing that's black and white because each individual is so different. We want to make sure that we understand that each person seeking services is an individual, whether they are a teen, child, or adult, whether they're male, female, non-binary, trans. Each person has their own unique history, background, and experiences. The ways in which an individual attempts to cope with the impact of trauma can appear destructive or confusing. We want to make sure that we understand that the individual's behaviors come from attempts to cope with past traumatic events, but behaviors continue in the present, even in the absence of the original source of the trauma. By understanding the behaviors of people who have been traumatized as adaptations to past threats, advocates can begin to conceive of new ways of interacting and connecting with individuals seeking our services. The last part of the presentation, we're going to talk about vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. So vicarious trauma characterizes the cumulative effects of working with survivors of traumatic life events such as sexual assault, child abuse, domestic violence, human trafficking. Vicarious trauma is a way of framing the emotional, physical, and spiritual transformations experienced by those who work with or learn about traumatized populations. So 3 of the important things you should know are that vicarious trauma manifests differently to each individual. It's cumulative, so the effect on helpers intensifies over time and with multiple clients, and it's pervasive. It affects all areas of the helpers' lives, including emotions, relationships, and their views of the world. There are different signs of vicarious trauma, and we want to remember that it affects everyone differently. So some common ways in which it shows is feelings of vulnerability. Hearing traumatic stories can cause a helper to question their own safety and feel that they and their loved ones are vulnerable. Examples of this would be being paranoid about being followed, worrying that your children will be sexually abused, and staying home more often. You might also develop difficulty trusting others. So after hearing accounts of abuse within intimate relationships through battering, acquaintance rape, and child sexual abuse, trusting someone can be really difficult. Example of this would be feeling like you're better off alone, hesitant to meet new people, questioning the behaviors of loved ones. And oftentimes victims of sexual assault might always feel like, especially if they have children, that their children are being sexually abused because that was their lived truth. And a changed view of the world. Interactions with the traumatized people can change a helper's ability and willingness to see the world as a good and safe place for themselves and those they love. Feelings of pessimism, cynicism, anger, hopelessness, and injustice about the world are just a few of the examples. These feelings can lead to diminished empathy and resentment towards victims and isolation. Compassion fatigue. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic and is expected to be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through the water without getting wet. So what are some signs of compassion fatigue? You might feel loss of purpose, anxiety, sleep disturbance, hypervigilance, pervasive hopelessness, self-doubt, inability to concentrate, disorganization, forgetfulness, withdrawal and isolation. You might feel like you're in an emotional roller coaster, feeling overwhelmed, poor self-care and appetite changes. We tend to minimize what we're going through. So what's one way in which we can help? We want to make sure that we're self-aware. So look at our personal history. Many people experience trauma in their lifetimes. While trauma may not result in PTSD or other functional impairment, it may have relational impact that remains hidden until purposefully exposed. So take time to reflect and reduce the power of your past experiences through therapy or other proactive means. Utilize your supervisors and your coworkers. Talk about what's going on. There are different ways that you can minimize vicarious trauma. There's awareness. Advocates need to take time to self-reflect. You can do this by journal writing, therapy, talking with a supervisor or a friend. Those are good examples of good habits that build self-awareness. Balance, maintaining healthy boundaries between work and home life is important. That really is so hard for advocates to have those healthy boundaries. And developing a non-trauma related interest and hobbies are critical. Learn to relax through meditation, quiet activities, or exercise can be emotionally restorative. And then connection. Having supportive colleagues or peers can help reduce isolation and give opportunities to share experiences or feelings. It's also an important way to develop and nurture trusting relationships. But that's really so important. That's what advocates, we have each other's backs, and we really couldn't do this job without each other. So remember, you can't pour from an empty cup. Take care of yourself first. Utilize those self-care options. If you're unsure of what to do, how to have good self-care, please talk with somebody. We all have different ideas and we can bounce them off of each other, but we want you to be safe and to take care of yourself. I appreciate, and I want you to, just a reminder of some simple tips. If you are feeling overwhelmed and need to maybe have a break, so care for your physical health, follow a proper diet, get adequate sleep, and do physical activities such as yoga, walking, etc. Care for your psychological health, know your limitations and your level of tolerance, keep boundaries that you set for yourself and others, identify triggers that may impact you, use music, humor, and art to process your emotional responses, seek therapy if you feel that it's necessary. Try to keep socially active, engage in social activities outside of work, seek emotional support from safe friends, coworkers, or family members. Number 4, pay attention to your personal morals. Clarify your own sense of meaning and purpose in your life. View your role as a caregiver, as a coach or guide, as opposed to fixing people's problems. Recognize that you can't take responsibility for others' healing. And then incorporate knowledge of your trauma into your professional life. Become knowledgeable about the impact of trauma. Identify your own personal reactions and plan the appropriate antidote. Normalize your reactions. Use a team for support. Seek supervision, please, and take breaks during the workday. Whether that means not working through your lunch break, getting up and walking around, going and joking around with coworkers, whatever you need to do to take that, take a little break, debrief with other folks that are in your agency. It's all so important. And then if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to one of us. We are here for you. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself so you can take care of others. Thank you.